Yes, it's been 10 minutes already. Maybe a lot of people might have run across the street to Dutch Bros to get their coffee, which is acceptable on my end, so that's okay. Got to get that energy, get you through the back half of the afternoon here. So listen, as we return from break, we'll turn our attention now to a particularly important issue for Oregon, and that's the management of our critical natural resources. You have to be living under a rock to miss some of the smoke blanketing our communities in the recent years. And wildfires are only expected to worsen as the climate continues to warm and forest management practices struggle to adapt. How can we manage our natural resources to boost the economy while protecting the environment? Our next two speakers will help us think through a question as it relates to our abundant forests and our increasingly limited water resources. First up is Matt Donegan, president of Donegan Advisors, who is currently serving as chair of Governor's Council on Wildfire Response and is a global leader in forest business and conservation. After Matt, we're thrilled to have Professor Martin Doyle from Duke University here with us today to share his insights on water management. Professor Doyle has experience in both academia and government, focusing on water policy in both roles. In 2015 and 16, he moved to the Department of Interior to spearhead the establishment of the Natural Resource Investment Center, an initiative to push forward private investment in water infrastructure. After Matt, we'll have a panel moderated by Sandy McDonough, President and CEO of Oregon Business and Industry, about innovations and Oregon businesses are pioneering in the fight against climate change. And finally, we'll hear about the future of electric mobility. In an exciting panel featuring Maria Pope, President and CEO of Portland General Electric, John O'Leary, Senior Vice President and CFO of Daimler Truck, and Doug Kelsey, General Manager of TriMet. But let's kick it off with talk about some forests, and please welcome Matt Donegan to the stage.
Good afternoon. You know, it's really heartbreaking to see what wildfire is doing to communities across the West. Whether it's images here from the Eagle Creek fire, which threatened both Troutdale and Hood River and filled the Portland air with smoke for several weeks back in 2017, or you think to the California and the Camp Fire that ravaged the small community of Paradise. These images are haunting and remind us of the vigilance that's needed. Again, it's really heartbreaking. But working with wildfire is not always heartbreaking. There are actually incredible people that you meet. It's been my distinct honor over the last year to be working with the Wildfire Council, which brings you face to face with Oregon's firefighters. And you get to see the incredible work they do, the way they put themselves in harm's way. And it's really, it's spent a couple days in a pickup truck with firefighters, and I'm sure you're going to get pumped up. And if you ever need more motivation, then I would just say you go out to the rural communities that are affected by wildfire and you hear their stories. And a lot of the stories is going to come with a lot of raw emotional content. You're going to hear what it's like to breathe this air and for kids not to be able to play outside. And you hear about just all the health effects and the economic damage in these communities. And you feel this real sense of obligation. You see here on this map some of the red areas around Bend and Medford and Hood River. These are areas that are living under siege right now. And you hear these stories and you face that raw emotional content. And again, I assure you it will be very, very motivating. So the Wildfire Council, the Governor Brown spoke to earlier today, in many ways traces its origins back to July of 2018, where Oregon did have its own tragedy. A fellow Oregonian, John Ruby, was killed while trying to plow a fire line and protect a neighbor's farm from the substation fire outside the Dalles. And Soon thereafter, Governor Brown started to assemble or put together the foundation for what became the Wildfire Council. And along that time, it was about a year ago, that I met here and said we needed senior state leadership to recognize that wildfire has become a statewide issue. It affects every Oregonian, and frankly, we need to look beyond the forest sector and the natural resource sector to leaders right here in this room. And we need the leaders from across the state to provide a new form of leadership and to recognize the importance of wildfire. And that's exactly what happened. Governor Brown, earlier this year, assembled 20 volunteers from across the state, east of the Cascades, west of the Cascades, public sector, private sector, conservation, timber, agriculture. Many say it's been an unprecedented assembly of professionals. Added to that were 20 paid staff that worked in an ex officio capacity, and added to that was 5 committees and subcommittees. We had over 100 people that worked throughout 2019 to try to address this question, which is what's working, what's not working, what should we keep and what should we change. We enjoyed tremendous leadership over the last year from the governor herself. Both U.S. senators and senior staff worked very hard throughout the year. We had 4 legislators on the council from across the aisle, state, Senate, and representatives. And ultimately, we delivered back in November a 110-page report that included 37 recommendations. Very comprehensive set of actionable recommendations heading into the 2020 legislative session. And I encourage you to read the report. You see the website there. That's where you can find it. But the 2 general conclusions are that, number 1, there is no free option available to us, but that the costs of inaction are much greater than the cost of action. I'll repeat that. Inaction is an option, and it is by far the costliest option. And the second is that we have entered a new era of wildfire. We are seeing dramatic upticks in wildfire activity across the globe, but particularly here in the West and here in Oregon, and that this new era requires modernization of the way we do things. As I mentioned, we had this diverse assembly of wildfire council members, and it was fantastic to hear all these new perspectives. One of the most commonly quoted council members was Kirsten Aird from the Oregon Health Authority. And she was, sitting there hearing all the testimony and so forth, and she just kind of spouted out, let's not forget, it's about the people. It's about the people. And so when you think about the consequences to people, it starts with human life, and that starts with our firefighters, who we send into harm's way. It also extends into the communities that are suffering from wildfire, and the key takeaway here is that with increased wildfire activity, with longer fire seasons, with more intensity, we're placing our firefighters and our communities at greater risk. The broader implications to people are around health effects. When you think about health effects, you think wildfire affects the air we breathe and the water we drink. Most obviously with smoke. Wildfire smoke is particularly harmful to human health with particulate matter. It gets embedded into our lungs, and our most vulnerable communities are those with pre-existing lung and heart conditions, elderly, children, pregnant women, and low income. And abundant research is developing that's showing just how harmful wildfire smoke is to human health. But beyond smoke, a less obvious but equally troubling pattern involves water quality. Because when you take a look at this image, you can imagine how this fire will clear out the vegetation on this hillside, and with that will come mudslides, and with that will come erosion, and we will see contaminants put into our drinking water. Here in Oregon, a large percentage of our drinking water comes from our forests, and with this increased risk from wildfire, we have substantial risks to our water supplies. So it starts with people, and it extends on to economic damage. If there was a second impetus behind the Wildfire Council, frankly, it was the public finances. We're seeing the costs of fighting fire escalating year after year, and the question becomes, how are we going to pay for this? And what's going to be the cost to schools and highways and all of our other public services? And it's true, we have been seeing climbing wildfire costs, but the research is abundantly clear that firefighting costs actually represent just a small percentage of the true economic damage from wildfire. So when you look at the impacts, the long-term impacts to property productivity, landscapes, natural resources, tourism, other agriculture, including vineyards who are affected by wildfire smoke, often what you find is that the costs can be 5, 10, 20, even 30 times the cost of the firefighting. On average, it's about 11 times is what the research shows. And if you look in Oregon in 2018, our total firefighting costs here, state and federal, were $533 million. You apply some sort of an average of 10 to 15, a multiple of 10 to 15 on that, and it's easily $5 billion or more. And you extend that out over 20 years, and you're easily talking about tens of billions of dollars of economic risk. That's already happening right now. And as you look ahead, all the trends are moving in the wrong direction. When you think about what are the main contributors to to wildfire, it's climate change, it's vegetation, and it's population growth. All three of these right now are at records and moving in the wrong direction. Climate change has caused our fire seasons in Oregon to extend by about 78 days over the last few decades, which is essentially doubling, and it's continuing to climb. Folks are predicting, as we look at as we look at California, you're looking at the future of Oregon. So what do we do? So there's abundant research that shows there's 3 broad goals that we should adapt. First one is fire-adapted communities. Second one is resilient landscapes. And third is safe and effective wildfire response, in other words, firefighting. I'm going to walk through each of these real quickly. Under fire-adapted communities, there's 3 main priorities that come out of that. Number 1, we should have safe breathing space, both residential and public, during fire events. Number 2, we should have safe transmission lines, power grid. And number 3, we should have safe neighborhoods. If you look at the safe neighborhoods, this is a good illustration. This comes from a leading source, Headwater Economics. They do a lot of research in this regard. And you can see on the left a kind of typical neighborhood design. And you see on the right one with appropriate vegetation control. So when we talk about safe neighborhoods, we're talking about safe vegetation and fuel control. You're talking about safe building materials, and you're also talking about safe road systems so that firefighters can access neighborhoods and people can escape. The second aspect is resilient landscapes, and here there's 3 main messages. Number 1 is that right now, Oregon's natural landscapes are highly departed from resiliency and from where they need to be. Over 100 years of fire suppression, changing land ownership, changing land management has left us with what one scientist from the Forest Service described as an epidemic of trees. We estimate that we have over 13 million acres in Oregon that is at significant high fire risk. That includes both forests and rangelands. And these landscapes need to be thinned. As you see on this illustration, a forest before and after, and you can imagine what the fire behavior will be on the image to the left versus the image on the right. Fire is a natural part of the ecosystem. It's actually very ecologically beneficial. Right now, our landscapes are not in the condition to receive wildfire, and we need to create those conditions. And the big bonus is that this creates jobs, real jobs. Restoring our forests across the state can create thousands of jobs in rural communities that really need economic revitalization. And the third element is safe and effective response. And again, by this, what we're talking about is firefighting. And here there's 2 main takeaways. The first one is we need to expand the amount of land that gets proactive coverage, protection here in Oregon. Right now, we protect about 16 million acres proactively. And we need to add about another 1 million acres. In another era, Our current 16 million acres might have sufficed. We're now in this era of climate change and vegetation, and excess vegetation and so forth, and we need to expand the area that we protect proactively. Think back to that substation fire, the fatality. If we had had proactive protection across the state at that point, some of that might have been prevented. The second major takeaway under safe and effective response is that we need to modernize. We've seen wildfire activity increase dramatically over the last 3 decades. We have not seen much of an increase in human resources or modernization of technology. In fact, we moved backwards during the global financial crisis, and we have not caught back up. And the indicator here is that you see a lot of overtime hours being logged by our firefighters, which brings concerns about fatigue and ultimately firefighter safety. So the solution here is more people and more equipment. And again, the two main takeaways from the report: there's no cost-free option here, but the cost of inaction far greater than the cost of action, to the tune of tens of billions of dollars, and that this new era we're in requires modernization. So where do we go from here? Well, I would say thus far, our progress has far exceeded my expectations. We've had fantastic leadership, we've done our homework, we've had great outreach with the legislators, and we have a pretty aggressive legislative agenda moving into 2020. So I think overall we're very encouraged. And what's next is we need to broaden and sustain our outreaches, which is what we're doing here today. So, like last year, where I invited leaders from this room to step up, once again, repeating that request. We need leaders from across the state. Own this issue as your own. This is one of the highest priorities facing Oregon. Own it as your own, or at least support those who are working on it themselves. The jury is out. The jury is back in, I should say. And this needs to be one of the highest priorities in the state. And we do not need the next great tragedy for us to understand this. Thank you.